I have a simple question for you. If you had to break down Yu-Gi-Oh decks in the broader categories, what would they be? It's a surprisingly tough question, especially if we try to match those definitions across Yu-Gi-Oh's 25-year-old history. Classic deck definitions in other games like aggro, mid-range, combo, and control don't really apply that well to Yu-Gi-Oh! Most Yu-Gi-Oh decks tend to be based around sizable core combos to build their game plan. Even historically, these combos would be quite long. The speed of modern board building means almost any deck can aggro and beat down from very little, and almost every deck is built around presenting control-oriented interactions in some form. It all makes Yu-Gi-Oh! A very tricky game to categorize. At most, I think we'd maybe want to keep the common definition of mid-range, but I still feel like mid-range as a concept is not at all helpful in understanding what Yu-Gi-Oh! Is, especially compared to any game with a hard resource system. Combo is also a term that should apply to a type of Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, but what a combo deck is in Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels different. Look, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a confusing mess, and we really don't have a proper terminology to describe it. So I'd like to take a look at the game and propose better descriptions for what a deck is, and start to clear up the mess of explaining the current format. We'll start by drawing a distinction between gimmicks, mechanics, and strategy. Mechanics are the type of card and general options a deck uses. Like, is a deck fusion, synchro, or link based? Does it use graveyard or banishment? Etc, etc. It's a broad categorization of what options a deck plays. Gimmicks are the more specific interactions and themes of a deck. For example, Sprite is mechanically a rank 2 deck. Its gimmick is being able to move around level 2 monsters from hand, deck, and graveyard and do linear summon combos. And this is going to be helpful for figuring out what a deck is, but not what the playstyle is. For that, we need to figure out its larger strategy, or what the gameplay implementation of the mechanics and gimmicks is. How is the deck actually trying to win? Luckily, there are very clear distinctions in decks once you actually sit down to play them. I mean, beyond surface level mechanics. Plant Link plays very differently from Rise Reel, and very differently from something like Labyrinth. They all combo, but the length, goals, and flexibility of those combos are different. Plant Link is actively trying to remove an opponent's ability to play through the use of an egregiously long combo. Rise Reel opts for a good enough combo, but one that is extremely resilient and useful. And Labyrinth seems to pivot its goals entirely to flex around an opponent's options. Even the methodology of deck building is changed from deck to deck. Rise Reel minimizes bricky, hard-to-play cards and shrinks its engine to absurd degrees. Labyrinth is very large on 2-ofs and situational cards, and plants are a mess of interlocking engines and dead draws. From here, I'd like to propose that 3 categories are the core of Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck types. The most common deck type is engine and staples. These decks have an incredibly compartmentalized and straightforward engine that flexes around common disruptions. These decks will run more than 20 non-engine pieces, limited to no bricks, and have a refined set of options. They tend to have relatively shorter combos for their format, force consistent inboards, and can be described as attempting to run as many of the best cards in a format as possible. From the past few years, I can point to Kashtira, Rise Reel, and some Sprite builds. Sprite depends, you can do some things with it. Toolbox decks are a more flexible version of engine and staples. Typically, they forgo straightforward combos for more opponent-dependent options and offer unique inboards for any situations. These decks will layer up smaller interactions and tend to be relatively grindy. From the past few years, I think of Tearlaments, Branded, or Labyrinth. Toolbox as a strategy is a bit harder to define, but I like to look for things like diverse extra decks, lots of 2-ofs and 1-ofs, and massively branching inboards. Really, you'll know what these are when you play it. For modern formats, combo decks are decks with actual 30 to 50 plus step combos. These options are trying to run through plays, often just to hard lock out an opponent or get an absurd level of value as to win a game immediately. You'll know a deck is likely a combo deck when separate engines switch into each other, and the deck's running more bricks than usual. A lot of decks using the Fiendsmith engine tend to fall into this area, as well as older examples like Plant Link or Infernoble Knights. Now, Wombo combo decks are a more extreme form of combo decks, still under the same umbrella and general terminology. When you're hitting more than 50 plus step combos and what plays you're doing start to become honestly a bit redundant, you're probably playing a Wombo combo deck. It's more a vibe than a strict categorization, and a lot of older decks with new support end up falling into this category, like 6 Samurai, and almost all viable FDKs fall under here. And that's my 3 basic Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck types. It's pretty straightforward, and it does kind of touch on strategies that you'd see in other games, but it is unique to Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's important. I did say that these categories should apply historically, and that's the neat part, they largely do. That is, if you're willing to scale these decks relatively with each other. Looking at the 2014 Hat format, Hat, Cat, and Yugioh are pretty easily engine and staple decks, running 20 of the best generic cards on top of a few powerful engines. Mermails are very close to a Toolbox deck, opting for a lower staple count to flex into more situational water monsters. This one is a bit confusing if you haven't played them, but 2014 Mermail combos are more of an option than the entire gimmick. And lastly, we have Sylvans as the very clear combo deck. That was an easy example, but to further prove my point, let's go way back around the first few sets of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'll look at the relatively diverse format of Critter, the second main format of the TCG, when the Sand, Ganon, Witch network means every deck is inherently heavy on searches, and the massive limited list meant a lot of 1-ofs. This is a great example to show these deck types are relative to what format they're in. The early staples in Engine deck is Mass Control, a deck literally built to push towards its generic engine pieces through the use of Mass Sorcerer to draw more cards. A more Toolbox heavy deck would be Muka Muka Turbo. It's got more coverage for edge cases, with additional pieces like Thunder Dragon, Last Will, and Robin Goblin. Despite sharing 32 of the same cards, the implementation of what these decks are is fundamentally different. Old formats are weird like that, especially because you're kind of expected to go through a lot more of your deck. But relatively speaking, Muka Muka Turbo is a Toolbox deck, and Mass Control is an engine and staples deck. For our combo example, we can look the Catapult Turtle OTK. It's got bricks and relatively longer combos for 2002, so I think it clearly fits. It's just not super relevant because it's bad. Overall, we can fit most deck strategies throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history into one of 3 categories. And it's not terrible, but I think it's fair to say we're missing a few outliers and less common strategies. 90% of playstyles is not all of them. Before we move on, while I'd assume you'd assume this, it's worth talking about how decks can be hybrids of multiple playstyles. Malice, for example, can be built as an engine and staple style deck, a Cyberse Toolbox style deck, or a hybrid of the two. It depends on how you want to play it. Or, in another example, if a format is fast enough, you could see an engine and staple deck have longer combos. We were kind of getting there when Dragon League and Adamancipator were the meta, but that's an argument on an old format. The point is, mixed categorizations is a feature of this classification system and not a bug. So real question, guys, how do we categorize a deck like this? This list has no combos, like 5 staples in total, and it certainly couldn't pivot into any other strategies. All it can do is stun an opponent. We can't just discount it. Even if it's a rarity, it has technically been fringe viable and has shown up in one shape or form throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Mystic Mine, Shane Byrne, Pac-Man, someone's gotta do it. This style of deck is based around stalling an opponent and removing whole mechanics and points of interaction from the game, oftentimes reducing matches to actual luck. Plain and simple, we'll just have to define this as stun and give it its own category. Stun is interesting because a large portion of the best decks in Yu-Gi-Oh's history pull from this category. Shadal's boss monster is a Floodgate, Imperial format Tomato Control alternated between making Genzo and Imperial Order, and Flunderies can abuse D-Shifter and Impin's Floodgate effects. But I wouldn't go all out and call these decks stun. Maybe it's close, but ultimately they're different. Tomato Control is the historical Toolbox deck, being able to pivot to literally any other card in the game. Flunderies is an older engine and staples deck, and Shadal has changed throughout the years, but most commonly it's a Toolbox strategy. At most you'd call these decks Helmet or something like Control, but it's more of a sub-categorization than a proper archetype. The hybrid description is perfect here. They would be Toolbox decks with a bit of stun, or stun Toolbox, something like that. It really kind of gets at the benefit of this type of system. For a deck to be proper stun, I'd say it's gotta have a relatively focused game plan, and really actively ignore the other playstyles, which none of these mentioned decks do. Maybe nowadays Flunderies is getting there, but that's another discussion. Yu-Gi-Oh is very nuanced. Another rare deck is the Go Second, or historically the OTK style deck. These decks are designed around entirely different mechanics, using staples and, most importantly, always opting to go second after winning the coin flip. They are built with the simple goal of going second, clearing your opponent's board, then just winning that turn or getting massive advantage. Some Sky Striker decks, Tempai, Mech Knights, or just classic Cyber Dragons. If it weren't for the differing staples or the coin flip, these would be very hard to tell apart at a glance, from decks like Engine and Staples or a Toolbox strategy. But I like to ask a simple question. How many cards in this deck don't do something when going first? If the answer is higher than 40%, then it's a Go Second deck. These don't make disruptions or common inboards like an Engine and Staples deck would, or a Toolbox would. Clarify it like this. You're not running an Engine and Staples strategy, you're running a Bricks and Staples strategy. So I'd argue that this categorization is needed, since it doesn't quite fit into another deck type. So where do we draw the line on alternative strategies? I'm sure you could force together a pile of random cards that has no real goal, or devise some arcane combo that wins by playing the game wrong through absurd means. But these really would fall outside the purview of what competitive Yu-Gi-Oh is. And if they were to become viable, they'd likely slip into a combination of one of the previous categories. But to give satisfaction to y'all, you can give these decks a 6th category. None. It's entirely outside the main sphere. So what was the point of this video? Well, to better explain what Yu-Gi-Oh decks are, to ourselves and to new players. People come from other games expecting a mid-range deck, and are presented with nonsense, and are rightfully upset at what they've been given. It really has been such a problem to categorize decks and general playstyles. I do a series where I try to break decks down for new players, and trying to break down stuff has always been a mess. I've made up some bad categorizations before, so having an extra description and a defined way to do it is very helpful. Categorizing decks also helps us ask the question, what makes Yu-Gi-Oh fun? I think that the most fondly remembered periods in Yu-Gi-Oh are the very toolbox-heavy decks. Because toolbox decks tend to be very skill-intensive, very grindy, and very back and forth. Hat, Edison, Rescue Ace, Necros, Clown, and Tearlaments, and Toss are all very toolbox-heavy formats. And I think it says something about what people like about Yu-Gi-Oh! Skill expression, back and forth gameplay, and responsive decks. Regardless of factors like power creep, price, or gimmicks. Maybe we need to create archetypes with solid access to generic tools, add dynamic layered effects to cards, and make sure cores can pivot in multiple directions and grind out games, without going too far and pushing decks another style. That being said, Engine and Staple decks are also a big part of what people enjoy about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, I find it very close to old school in terms of deck building and ratios, especially with the generic utility of cards. Despite the more boxed-in nature of these decks, they're certainly not without skill expression. I mean, go watch some tournament games of Yu-Gi-Oh! It can get pretty intense. But engine design is kind of a solution to try and create failed toolbox decks while being more sure it's under control. It's why Konami has been trying to release archetypes with smaller and smaller engines, mostly because it's easy to balance. I don't think it's worked most of the time, but they are trying. It is worth mentioning that there is a very large niche of players who gravitate towards more toxic strategies like stun or combo. I should know, I am a combo player. Maybe this type of player enjoys winning exclusively, more extreme skill expression, or perhaps just making an opponent miserable. It is what it is, and these players will find a home somewhere. Designing decks in any card game around this niche is hard, and it's clear that a majority of the most extreme combo decks are unintentional. It really is a surface level discussion of what's fun and how to design for it. That's a whole separate topic and a whole nother video. But it's worth to bring up and start thinking about. I enjoy talking about this. And that's all for this time. Don't forget to like and Don't forget to like and subscribe. I die a little inside every time I say that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.